At my husband's memorial, my daughter-in-law said I had no place there. She regretted it before the service ended. The morning of Thomas's memorial service dawned with a pale winter sun that offered no warmth. I'd spent hours preparing myself, both mentally and physically. After 42 years of marriage, how do you say goodbye? I chose his favorite dress of mine, a navy blue one with small white dots that he always said brought out the blue in my eyes. He'd bought it for our 35th anniversary. I wanted to honor him by wearing it one last time. I arrived early at the chapel, clutching my purse with trembling hands. Inside were the eulogy I had written and rewritten a dozen times, and a small silver pocket watch that had belonged to Thomas's father. He would have wanted Michael to have it today. People were already gathering outside the chapel. Colleagues, friends, neighbors. Some nodded in somber recognition as I passed. Others embraced me gently, murmuring condolences that washed over me like distant waves. I was searching for my son Michael, hoping to have a moment with him before the service began. Before we continue, comment where you're watching from and subscribe to the channel. We'd love to see how far our stories are reaching. Instead, I found Vanessa. My daughter-in-law stood at the entrance to the chapel like a sentinel. She wore an expensive black dress, and not a single hair was out of place. I'd always thought she was beautiful in a cold, polished way. Today, that coldness seemed to radiate from her as our eyes met. "Eleanor," she said, my name sounding like an accusation on her lips. "Vanessa," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "How is Michael holding up?" "He's with family," she answered, emphasizing the word family in a way that made me flinch. Inside. I nodded and moved to step past her, but she shifted, blocking my path. For a moment, we stood in awkward silence as more guests arrived behind me. "We've arranged the seating," she said, her voice carrying just enough to ensure those nearby could hear. "The immediate family will be in the front row." "Of course," I said, confused by her statement of the obvious. I was Thomas's wife, his immediate family. Vanessa's perfectly manicured hand gripped my arm. "Eleanor, I think it's best if you sit further back." I stared at her, not comprehending. "I'm sorry." "You have no place in the front row," she said, her voice sharp but controlled. "You weren't a real wife to Thomas, everyone knows that." The world seemed to stop. People around us fell silent. I could feel their eyes on me, hear their uncomfortable shifting. "I'm his wife," I said, hearing the tremor in my voice. I was his wife for 42 years. A wife who lived separate lives for the last 10 years. Vanessa countered. A wife who wasn't there when he needed you. Her voice dropped to a whisper. "You weren't a real part of this family, Eleanor. Not for a long time." I looked past her, searching desperately for Michael. He stood just inside the doorway watching our exchange. Our eyes met, and I silently pleaded with him to intervene, to say something. Instead, he looked away, pretending to adjust his tie. That moment of rejection from my own son cut deeper than anything Vanessa could ever say. "I belong with my family," I said, my voice stronger now, fueled by a sudden spark of anger. "Do you?" Vanessa's smile was pitying. "Because your son disagrees." She gestured to one of the ushers. "Please show Mrs. Williams to a seat in the back." Rose. I felt a gentle hand on my elbow and realized I was being guided away from the front row where my son sat, away from the casket of my husband, as if I were a distant relative or a casual acquaintance rather than the woman who had loved Thomas for over 4 decades. As the service began, I sat alone in the 5th row, clutching my purse in my lap. From here, I could barely see the gleaming surface of Thomas's casket. I couldn't see Michael's face at all. Only Vanessa was visible, her straight back and perfect posture a silent statement of triumph. Pastor Wilson spoke about Thomas's life, his contributions to the community, his love for his family. I closed my eyes, memories washing over me in painful waves. Thomas and I dancing in our kitchen on our 20th anniversary. Thomas teaching Michael to ride a bike while I watched from the porch, my heart in my throat each time our son wobbled. Thomas holding my hand through the night when my mother died. The Thomas they described today was a stranger, a successful businessman, a golf enthusiast, a generous donor to local charities. Where was the man who sang off-key in the shower? The man who could never remember to put the cap back on the toothpaste? The man who brought me wildflowers every spring just because they made me smile? When Michael rose to speak, my heart clenched. My son, our son, looked so much like his father that it physically hurt to see him. He spoke eloquently about Thomas's legacy, his work ethic, the lessons he'd taught him. Not once did he mention me or the home we had built together. "My father taught me what it means to be a man," Michael said, his voice breaking slightly. "And in his final years, he was blessed to have people who truly cared for him, who were there for him when he needed them most." His eyes flickered to Vanessa, who dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. I felt as though I had been erased, not just from the funeral, but from the narrative of Thomas's life, as if the decades we shared had been reduced to nothing, overwritten by the story Vanessa had crafted. When the service ended, people filed past the family to offer condolences. I watched as they embraced Michael and Vanessa, speaking words of comfort that I couldn't hear from my distant seat. No one approached me. Perhaps they didn't know what to say, or perhaps Vanessa's very public rejection had made them uncertain of my status. I remained seated, feeling hollow and detached from the proceedings, as if I were watching a play about strangers rather than the farewell to my husband. "Eleanor?" I looked up to see Richard Thompson, Thomas's oldest friend, standing beside my pew. His kind eyes were filled with concern. "Richard," I whispered, the simple act of saying his name nearly breaking my composure. He sat beside me, taking my hand in his. "This isn't right," he said quietly. "Thomas would be furious if he could see this." "It doesn't matter now," I said, though the words tasted bitter. "It does matter," Richard insisted, "and Tom knew it might come to this. That's why." He hesitated, then reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a small envelope. "He asked me to give you this. After." I took the envelope with trembling fingers. My name was written on the front in Thomas's familiar handwriting. "Not here," Richard advised gently. "Later, when you're alone." As people began to move toward the reception area, Richard helped me to my feet. "I'll escort you," he said firmly. "I'm not sure I'm welcome," I admitted. "You were Thomas's wife," Richard said, loud enough for those nearby to hear. "Of course you're welcome, and I intend to make sure everyone remembers that." As we walked together toward the reception hall, I felt something shift inside me. The numbness began to recede, replaced by a quiet determination. I may have been publicly rejected by my daughter-in-law and silently abandoned by my son, but I had spent 42 years loving Thomas Williams. No one could take those years away from me, and whatever was in that envelope might just change everything. The reception was held at the country club where Thomas and I had been members for over 30 years. As Richard and I walked through the elegant doors, I felt the weight of stares. People quickly averted their eyes when I caught them looking. Embarrassment, pity, or perhaps simple discomfort at not knowing how to treat the widow who had been so publicly demoted. Richard stayed by my side like a shield as we made our way through the crowd. Michael stood near the bar with Vanessa, accepting condolences and managing to look both grieved and strangely detached. When he saw me approaching with Richard, something flickered across his face. Guilt, perhaps, but it was quickly smothered. "Mom," he said stiffly, allowing me to embrace him. His body remained rigid, a mannequin in my arms. "Michael," I whispered against his cheek. "I'm so sorry." I didn't specify what I was sorry for. Thomas's death, the distance between us, all of it. Vanessa appeared at his side, placing a proprietary hand on his arm. "Eleanor," she acknowledged with a slight nod. "The caterers did a lovely job, don't you think?" Small talk. At my husband's funeral reception, as if we were at a garden party. "I wouldn't know," I replied truthfully. "I wasn't involved in the planning." A silence fell between us, awkward and heavy. "Tom always said Eleanor made the best chicken salad in the county," Richard interjected, his voice deliberately light. "Remember those summer picnics by the lake, Michael? Your mother would pack enough food to feed an army." Michael's expression softened momentarily. "Dad always requested her potato salad for his birthday," he said, then caught himself as Vanessa's fingers tightened on his arm. "Ancient history," she said with a dismissive wave. "Michael, the Hendersons want to speak with you about the charity fund." As they moved away, Richard sighed heavily. "Come on, Eleanor. Let's find somewhere quiet for a moment." He led me to a small alcove away from the main reception area. Once we were seated, he leaned forward, his voice low. "When did it get this bad?" I stared at my hands, noticing how the veins stood out like blue rivers beneath my skin. When had I gotten so old? When had everything changed so much? "It was gradual," I answered finally. So slow I almost didn't notice until it was too late. My mind drifted back to the beginning. Not the beginning of the end, but the beginning of everything. Thomas and I had met during my final year of nursing school. He was already working at his father's manufacturing company, ambitious and driven. I had dreams too. Plans to become a surgical nurse, maybe even pursue medical school eventually. I was going to be a surgical nurse, I told Richard, though. He already knew this part of our history. I had offers from 3 hospitals, I remember, Richard said gently. You were brilliant. I smiled at the memory of my younger self's ambitions. Then Thomas proposed, and his father offered him the position in Chicago. Thomas was so excited about the opportunity. And you gave up your career to follow him, Richard supplied. I shook my head. I didn't see it that way then. I thought we were building something together. His success would be our success. The first few years had been happy ones. We bought a small house and I worked at the local hospital while Thomas climbed the corporate ladder. When I became pregnant with Michael, we were overjoyed. Thomas's business trips became more frequent, but I didn't mind. I had Michael, my nursing shifts, and our future to focus on. When did Vanessa enter the picture? Richard asked, pulling me back to the present. Michael met her at Northwestern. She was studying art history, I said, remembering my initial impression of her. Confident, beautiful, ambitious in her own carefully calculated way. Thomas liked her immediately. She knew exactly what to say, how to impress him. And you? I hesitated. I thought she was. Intense, very focused on appearances and status. But Michael was so in love. I twisted my wedding ring, still on my finger after all these years. After they married, things changed. Michael called less, visited less. Vanessa always had some reason why they couldn't make it for holidays or birthdays. Tom never said anything? I laughed softly, without humor. Thomas was barely home himself by then. The company was expanding internationally. He was in Tokyo or London or Singapore more often than he was in Chicago. I didn't tell Richard how I'd spend weeks alone in our big house, waiting for phone calls that sometimes never came. How I'd kept busy with volunteer work at the hospital, with gardening, with book clubs, anything to fill the silence. How I'd go to bed alone and wake up alone most days of the year. But you stayed, Richard observed. I stayed, I echoed. The simple truth of those 2 words contained decades of choices, compromises, and quiet disappointments. We had an understanding. Thomas and I. He built his business, I built our home. It wasn't perfect, but it was ours. What I didn't say was how the distance had grown year by year, not just physically, but emotionally. How Thomas's rare weekends at home had become exercises in polite conversation between strangers who happened to share a house and a history. How Vanessa had stepped into that void, becoming Thomas's confidant in business matters, arranging his social calendar, managing his public image. When Thomas got sick, I continued, I thought things would change. I thought we'd have time to reconnect, to remember why we'd chosen each other all those years ago. Richard's expression darkened. But Vanessa took over. I nodded, remembering those painful months. Suddenly, she was coordinating his medical care, speaking to his doctors. She installed a home office in our guest room so Michael could continue managing the company while being close to his father. What I didn't mention was how I'd been systematically pushed aside, my nursing background dismissed as outdated, my intimate knowledge of Thomas's preferences ignored. How I'd once walked into our bedroom to find Vanessa rearranging Thomas's medications, telling him that the schedule I'd established wasn't optimal. How Thomas, weakened by illness and treatments, had begun to defer to her in matters that had once been between husband and wife. The worst part, I admitted, my voice dropping to a whisper, is that Thomas let it happen. Maybe he was too tired to fight. Maybe he actually preferred her way of doing things. I don't know. But he let her take over. Richard reached across the table and squeezed my hand. Tom was not himself those last months, Eleanor. The pain medications, the treatments, they changed him. I wanted to believe that. I desperately wanted to believe that the Thomas I had married, the man I had loved for most of my life, hadn't willingly pushed me to the periphery of his final days, that he hadn't chosen Vanessa's efficient, business-like approach to dying over my more emotional, intimate care. The last conversation we had alone, I said, feeling tears threaten, he was lucid, between doses of morphine. He held my hand and told me he was sorry. Just that, "I'm sorry, Ellie," then he fell asleep. The next day, Vanessa hired a private nurse and said I needed rest. After that, I was rarely alone with him. Richard's face showed a grief that matched my own. Oh, Eleanor. 3 days before he died, I wasn't even allowed in the room. Vanessa said he was having important business discussions with Michael and couldn't be disturbed. I took a shuddering breath. My husband was dying, and I was treated like an unwelcome visitor in my own home. I looked across the reception hall to where Vanessa stood, accepting condolences with perfect composure, her hand never leaving Michael's arm. She had won. She had successfully edged me out of my husband's life, and now she was doing the same with his death. That envelope, I said, suddenly remembering. What did Thomas want me to have? Richard glanced around to ensure we weren't overheard. He said you'd know what to do with it, that it would help you reclaim what's yours. Before I could ask what that meant, a shadow fell across our table. Michael stood there, his expression unreadable. "The Robertsons are leaving, Mom. They want to say goodbye to you." As I rose to perform this final social duty, I felt the envelope in my purse like a burning coal. Whatever Thomas had left me, whatever message he had sent from beyond the grave, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. I was done being erased. The house felt emptier than ever when I returned that evening. For weeks during Thomas's illness, it had been filled with people, nurses, doctors, Michael and Vanessa, business associates making their respectful visits. Now it was just me, alone with the hollow echo of my footsteps on the hardwood floors. I moved through the familiar rooms, like a ghost. In the kitchen, I absently touched the countertops Thomas had insisted on replacing 5 years ago. Norwegian granite, he'd explained proudly, though I'd been perfectly happy with what we had. The living room still held the faint scent of his cologne, or perhaps that was just my imagination desperately clinging to his presence. Upstairs, I paused outside our bedroom door. During his final months, Thomas had slept in the downstairs guest suite that Vanessa had converted into a proper sick room. I hadn't been in our bedroom since the day after he died, when I'd sought refuge there from the parade of visitors. I pushed the door open slowly. Everything was exactly as we'd left it. His reading glasses on the nightstand, a half-read biography of Churchill, his slippers tucked neatly under the edge of the bed. I sat heavily on his side of the mattress and finally allowed the tears to come. Not the restrained, dignified grief I'd maintained throughout the memorial service, but raw, gasping sobs that shook my entire body. I cried for the young couple we had once been, full of dreams and promises. I cried for the years of slow disconnection, the growing silence between us. I cried for the final betrayal of being pushed aside during his last days, of watching another woman take my place at his bedside. When the storm of tears finally subsided, I remembered the envelope. I retrieved my purse from where I'd dropped it by the door, and carefully withdrew the small white envelope Richard had given me. My name was written in Thomas's distinctive handwriting, not his once bold strokes, but the tremulous script of his final weeks. Inside was a single key and a brief note. Storage unit number 247, Lakeview Facility. What's inside belongs only to you. I'm sorry for everything, Ellie. I stared at the key, turning it over in my palm. Thomas had called me Ellie only in our most private moments, a nickname that had gradually disappeared from use as our marriage cooled. Seeing it in his handwriting sent a fresh pang through my heart. What could be in this storage unit? And why the secrecy? Thomas and I had shared everything. At least I had thought we did. The idea that he had been keeping something hidden from me, something important enough to arrange this posthumous delivery, was unsettling. I couldn't wait until morning. Despite the late hour and my exhaustion, I changed clothes, grabbed my car keys, and headed to the Lakeview storage facility. The night attendant barely glanced up from his magazine as I signed in, simply pointing me toward the elevator that would take me to the second floor where unit number 247 was located. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as I walked down the long corridor lined with identical metal doors. My footsteps echoed in the empty hallway, my shadow stretching before me, like an omen. When I reached number 247, I hesitated, key poised at the lock. What would I find inside? A confession? Evidence of some betrayal I hadn't even suspected? Or something worse, confirmation that Thomas had been planning to leave me before his illness. Struck? I took a deep breath and turned the key. The lock clicked, and I rolled the door upward, wincing at the metallic screech that broke the silence. Inside, I found not the handful of boxes I had expected, but a room filled with carefully arranged filing cabinets, plastic storage bins, and a single desk with a lamp. I flipped the switch, blinking in the sudden light. The walls were covered with photographs, hundreds of them, chronicling our life together. Our wedding day. The day we brought Michael home from the hospital. Family vacations, Christmas mornings, graduations, anniversaries. The visual evidence of a shared life that I had begun to doubt even existed in Thomas's memory. On the desk sat a leather-bound journal with another envelope resting on top, again addressed to me in Thomas's handwriting. My fingers trembled as I opened it. "My dearest Ellie," it began, and I had to stop, pressing the paper to my chest as emotion overwhelmed me. When I could see clearly again, I continued reading. "If you're reading this, then I'm gone, and Richard has fulfilled his promise to me. I know you must have questions. Why this secret place exists. Why I never spoke of it to you. The truth is both simple and shameful. I was a coward. When I first became ill, I thought we would face it together, as we should have. But then, Vanessa took control in that way she has. Efficient, unstoppable, brooking no argument. And I let her, because it was easier than fighting, easier than admitting how much I had let slip away between us over the years. I watched you being pushed aside day by day. I saw the hurt in your eyes when decisions were made without consulting you. I heard the tremor in your voice when you were contradicted and dismissed in our own home, and still I said nothing. But in the quiet moments, in the spaces between pain and medication, I began to see with terrible clarity what I had allowed to happen, not just during my illness, but for years before. I had permitted Vanessa to drive a wedge between us, between you and Michael. I had chosen the path of least resistance, telling myself it was for the best, that you and I had grown apart naturally, that Michael was simply living his own life. That was the lie I told myself. The truth is in this room. The journal on the desk contains everything. My thoughts, my regrets, the patterns I finally recognized too late. And the cabinets contain evidence that may shock you. I discovered, in my final months, that Vanessa has been systematically isolating and controlling Michael, much as she did with me. There are financial records here that trouble me deeply. Conversations I recorded when I became suspicious. Documents that were never meant for your eyes or mine, revealing plans, for after my death that would leave you with nothing. I was too weak to confront them, too afraid of losing the little time I had left with my son if I forced the issue. So instead, I created this place, gathering evidence bit by bit with Richard's help when I could still move about. Use it wisely. Ellie, not for revenge. We are better than that, you and I, but for truth, for protection, for reclaiming your rightful place. I failed you in so many ways. I can only hope that this final act might begin to make amends. With love and regret, Thomas. I sank into the desk chair, letter clutched in my hand, overwhelmed by conflicting emotions, vindication, grief, anger, and a terrible sadness for the wasted years and missed opportunities. The Thomas who wrote this letter was the man I had married, the man I thought I had lost long ago. He had seen the truth, even if too late to act on it himself. I pulled the journal toward me and began to read. Hours passed as I immersed myself in Thomas's private thoughts, his growing awareness of Vanessa's manipulation, his regret over our estrangement, his fears for Michael's future. Interspersed were tender remembrances of our early years, moments I had thought he'd forgotten. When I finally turned to the filing cabinets, what I found left me breathless. Financial records showing substantial sums being diverted from Thomas's personal accounts into offshore holdings accessible only to Vanessa. Emails between Vanessa and various attorneys discussing ways to challenge Thomas's existing will. Recorded. Conversations where she coached Michael on how to manage his father's perceptions during his illness. Most damning of all was a draft of a revised will, never executed, that would have effectively disinherited me from almost everything Thomas and I had built together over 4 decades. Vanessa's fingerprints were all over it, her language, her demands, her vision for the future. I worked through the night, carefully examining each document, each revelation. By the time dawn light began to filter through the small window high, on the storage unit wall, I had filled a notebook with notes and formulated the beginnings of a plan. As I gathered the most critical documents to take with me, my phone chimed with an incoming text. It was from Michael. "Mom, we need to meet. Coming by the house at 10. Important matters to discuss." I looked at the files in my hands, the evidence of betrayal and manipulation spanning years. Michael was coming to the house, Vanessa undoubtedly with their own agenda. But now, I had Thomas's final gift, the truth, and I wasn't going to waste it. I arrived home with barely enough time to shower and change before Michael and Vanessa were due to arrive. My mind was racing, cataloging the evidence I'd discovered, plotting how to use it. Part of me wanted to confront them immediately with everything I knew, to watch the color drain from Vanessa's perfectly made-up face as her schemes unraveled. But Thomas's final letter cautioned wisdom, not revenge. I needed to be strategic. I was arranging a selection of Thomas's journals and the most damning financial documents on the dining room table when the doorbell rang. Taking a deep breath, I smoothed my hands over my simple black dress and went to answer it. Michael stood on the porch alone, his father's height and build a painful reminder of all I had lost. For a moment, we simply looked at each other. Despite everything, this was my son, the baby I had nursed, the boy whose scraped knees I had bandaged, the teenager whose heart I had helped mend after his first breakup. "Where's Vanessa?" I asked, stepping aside to let him in. "Parking the car," he replied, then hesitated. "Mom, I think we should talk before she joins us." I led him to the living room rather than the dining room where my evidence lay waiting. "I'm listening." Michael ran a hand through his hair, a gesture so like his father's that my heart constricted. "There are decisions that need to be made. About the house, Dad's personal effects, the company shares. Your father's will covers all of that," I said carefully. "Yes, but..." He trailed off as the front door opened and Vanessa swept in without knocking. She wore an impeccable black suit, her blonde hair pulled back in a severe knot. "Eleanor," she acknowledged with a cool nod. "I see Michael has started without me." "We were just about to discuss Thomas's will," I said. Vanessa's smile didn't reach her eyes. "Exactly why we're here. To make things easier for everyone." "Easier?" I echoed. "Mom," Michael interjected, "we think it would be best if you considered moving to a smaller place. This house is too big for one person, and the maintenance alone..." "What your son is trying to say," Vanessa cut in smoothly, "is that it makes financial sense to liquidate this property now. The market is excellent, and the proceeds would set you up comfortably in a nice retirement community." I stared at them, momentarily speechless. Less than 24 hours after burying my husband, they were suggesting I sell the home we had shared for 35 years. "And I suppose you have some suggestions about where I should go?" I asked, my voice deceptively calm. Vanessa brightened, pulling a glossy brochure from her handbag. "Lakeside Gardens. It's a wonderful senior living community just outside the city. We've already spoken with the management." "You what?" I interrupted, heat rising to my face. "It's just preliminary inquiries," Michael said quickly. "But they have an opening now, and these places fill up fast." "How convenient," I said, my tone making Michael shift uncomfortably. "And what about the company shares Thomas left me?" Vanessa and Michael exchanged a glance. "That's the other thing we wanted to discuss," Michael said. "It would simplify matters if you let me vote your shares by proxy. You've never been involved in the business, and there are some important decisions coming up." "What my husband means," Vanessa clarified, "is that those shares represent significant responsibility. At your age, and with your limited understanding of the business world, it would be a burden." "At my age," I repeated flatly, "and with my limited understanding." "Mom, be reasonable," Michael pleaded. "Dad would want the company to thrive." "You know he would, do I?" I stood up, feeling a strange calm settle over me. "Why don't we continue this discussion in the dining room? I have something to show you both." I led them through the house, watching as Vanessa's eyes cataloged everything, already mentally redecorating or calculating values. When we reached the dining room, I gestured for them to sit. The folders and journals I had arranged were clearly visible, though not yet opened. "What's all this?" Michael asked, frowning. "Your father's legacy," I said simply. "Not the public one, the private one." I opened the first folder, revealing bank statements with highlighted transfers. "Thomas kept meticulous records. Did you know that, Vanessa? He documented every unusual transaction, every conversation that troubled him." Vanessa's composed expression faltered for just a second before she recovered. "I'm not sure what you're implying, Eleanor, but if you're suggesting..." "I'm not suggesting anything," I cut in, opening another folder. "I'm stating facts, like the fact that over the past year, nearly $2 million was transferred from Thomas's personal accounts to offshore holdings that only you can access. Michael's head snapped toward his wife. "What is she talking about?" Vanessa laughed, a brittle sound. "This is absurd. Your mother is clearly confused. Grief does terrible things to people, especially at her age." "My age again," I mused, selecting another document. Tell me, does my age also make me imagine emails like this one? I slid a printed email across the table, where you consulted with an attorney about having Thomas declared mentally incompetent 6 months ago, when he was perfectly lucid and simply questioning some of your financial decisions. Michael picked up the email, his face paling as he read. Vanessa, what the hell is this? It's obviously fabricated, she snapped, but her voice had lost its certainty. I continued, relentless now. Or perhaps I'm imagining these recorded conversations where you coach Michael on what to say to his father, where you discuss how to ensure I'm left with just enough to keep her quiet after Thomas dies. Michael looked stricken. Mom, I never... Play the recording, Michael, I said quietly, pushing my phone toward him. Listen to yourself. As Michael listened, his expression transformed from disbelief to horror to shame. Vanessa's perfect composure had cracked completely. 2 bright spots of color burned on her cheeks, and her eyes darted around the room like trapped animals. This proves nothing, she hissed. Thomas was confused during his illness. He was paranoid, imagining conspiracies. Was he paranoid when he discovered the draft of a new will? I countered, producing the document. A will that would have left me with barely enough to survive while transferring control of everything. To you, Vanessa? Not even to Michael. To you. Michael took the draft with trembling hands. This isn't what we discussed, he whispered, looking at his wife. You said we were just updating things, modernizing the structure. She's manipulating you, Vanessa said desperately, placing a hand on his arm. Just like she manipulated your father for years. She's trying to come between us, like you. Came between me and my son? I asked, my voice steady despite the emotion churning inside me. Like you came between me and my husband in his final days? I opened Thomas's journal to a marked page. Thomas wrote this 3 weeks before he died. I see now what Vanessa has been doing all these years. She's isolated Eleanor, turned Michael against his mother, and positioned herself as the only voice I can trust. My greatest regret is that I allowed it to happen. My greatest fear is what she will do to both of them when I'm gone. The silence that followed was absolute. Vanessa's hand had fallen from Michael's arm, and she sat rigidly, her face a mask of fury and calculation. Michael looked lost, a man whose foundations had suddenly crumbled beneath him. Why? He finally asked his wife. Why would you do this? Vanessa's laugh was ugly. Why? Because your mother was in my way. Because your father had outlived his usefulness. Because you were too blind to see what needed to be done to secure our future. The naked ambition in her voice seemed to physically strike Michael. He recoiled, staring at her as if seeing her for the first time. Get out, he said quietly. Michael, don't be ridiculous. Get out of my mother's house, he repeated, his voice stronger. Now. Vanessa glanced between us, assessing the situation, with cold precision. Whatever she saw in our faces must have convinced her that retreat was her best option, for now. This isn't over, she said, rising and gathering her purse. You have no idea who you're dealing with. She stalked toward the door, then turned for one parting shot. And you, she directed at Michael, can find somewhere else to sleep tonight. The door slammed behind her, leaving Michael and me in a silence laden with years of unspoken truths and fresh revelations. Mom, he began, his voice breaking. I didn't know. I swear I didn't know the extent of it. I looked at my son, really, looked at him, and saw not just the man who had allowed me to be humiliated at his father's funeral, but also the boy who had once trusted me implicitly. The damage Vanessa had done went deeper than I had realized. We have a lot to talk about, I said finally, and a lot to repair. Michael nodded, tears filling his eyes. I'm so sorry, he whispered. Dad would be ashamed of me. No, I said firmly, reaching across the table to take his hand. Your father loved you, Michael. He was trying to protect you just as he was trying to protect me. That's why he left this evidence, not to punish anyone, but to reveal the truth. Outside, we heard the screech of tires as Vanessa's car peeled away from the curb. This confrontation was over, but I harbored no illusions that the war was won. Vanessa would regroup, strategize, and return with new weapons. But for the first time since Thomas's diagnosis, I felt a flicker of hope. My son was looking at me with clear eyes. The truth, painful as it was, had been spoken aloud, and somewhere, I like to think that Thomas was finally at peace. Chapter 5. The Moment of Truth. After Vanessa left, Michael and I sat in weighted silence at the dining room table. The evidence of his wife's betrayal lay scattered between us like the aftermath of a storm. My son looked hollowed out, a man whose entire reality had collapsed in minutes. "Would you like some tea?" I finally asked, falling back on the small comforts that had sustained me through grief and hardship. Michael gave a broken laugh. "Tea? God, Mom. I just found out my wife has been manipulating me for years, tried to rob you blind, and probably hastened Dad's decline with her schemes. I don't think tea is going to fix this." "No," I agreed softly, "but it's a place to start." In the kitchen, I moved through the familiar ritual of filling the kettle, warming the pot, measuring the loose leaves Thomas had always preferred over tea bags. Michael watched me from the doorway, a stranger in the home where he'd grown up. "How did I not see it?" he asked, his voice hollow. "How could I have been so blind?" I set 2 mugs on the counter, considering my words carefully. "Love makes us vulnerable, Michael. It can also make us blind." "It wasn't just love," he admitted, sinking into a kitchen chair. "It was ambition, too. Vanessa made me feel like we were building something important together, something bigger than what you and Dad had created." The kettle whistled, saving me from having to respond immediately. I poured the boiling water into the teapot, watching the leaves swirl and unfurl. When I finally spoke, I chose honesty over comfort. "Your father built his business because he wanted to provide for us, to create security. Somewhere along the way, the business became more important than the people it was meant to protect." I set a steaming mug in front of him. "I'm afraid you inherited that from him." Michael flinched, but didn't argue. "I remember when I was little, how Dad would come home and scoop me up, tell me stories about his day like I was his business partner." His eyes took on a faraway look. "Then one day he just stopped coming home for dinner, stopped telling stories." "He was building the Singapore branch," I said, remembering those years of increasing absences. "He thought he was securing your future, while Vanessa was making plans to secure hers at both our expenses." Michael's hand tightened around his mug. "What happens now, Mom?" It was the question I'd been asking myself all night as I pored through Thomas's hidden files. What did happen now? Part of me wanted justice, to see Vanessa exposed and punished for her manipulation and financial misdeeds. Part of me simply wanted peace, a chance to mourn my husband properly and rebuild my relationship with my son. "There will be legal consequences," I said finally. "The money she diverted, the attempted fraud, those are criminal matters. Richard has already connected me with a good attorney." "You've spoken to Richard about this?" Michael looked surprised. "He was helping your father gather evidence for months. Thomas trusted him completely." Michael nodded slowly. "And what about us? You and me?" The vulnerability in his question transported me back decades, to a 6-year-old Michael asking if I would still love him after he broke my favorite vase. My answer now was both simpler and more complicated than it had been then. "That depends on you," I said honestly, "on whether you're willing to see the truth about the past few years, about the memorial service yesterday." He had the grace to look ashamed. "I should have stood up for you. When Vanessa said those things, made you sit in the back, I should have stopped her." "Yes," I agreed. "You should have. I can make excuses, say I was grieving, that I wasn't thinking clearly, but the truth is, I was a coward." He met my eyes directly. "I've been a coward for years, Mom, taking the easy path, letting Vanessa make decisions I knew in my heart were wrong." The clock on the wall ticked steadily, marking seconds of silence between us as I considered his words. Outside the kitchen window, I could see the Japanese maple Thomas had planted for our 20th anniversary, its leaves now turning scarlet with the approach of fall. "Your father wrote something in his journal that I haven't been able to stop thinking about," I said finally. "He wrote that the true measure of a life isn't in what you build or what you own, but in who remains faithful when everything else falls away." Michael's eyes glistened with unshed tears. "I failed that measure." "No," I corrected gently. "You lost your way. There's a difference. The question is whether you're willing to find your way back." Before he could answer, his phone buzzed with an incoming text. He glanced at it, his expression hardening. "Vanessa," he said grimly. "She's already contacted the company board members. She's telling them I've had some kind of breakdown, that you're manipulating me in my grief. She's trying to call an emergency vote to remove me as CEO." I wasn't surprised. Vanessa had always been nothing if not efficient. "What will you do?" I asked. Michael straightened, and for the first time I saw a flash of his father's determination in his face. "I'm going to fight. For the company. For Dad's legacy." He paused, reaching across the table to take my hand. "And for you, Mom, if you'll let me." The simple touch, his hand warm around mine, broke something inside me. All the years of polite distance, of watching my son drift away under Vanessa's influence, seemed to crystallize in this one moment of connection. "We'll fight together," I said, squeezing his hand. "It's what your father would have wanted. 6 months can change everything." Spring blossomed outside as I reviewed the final settlement papers in what was now my study, Thomas's old sanctuary, that I had finally claimed as my own. Vanessa hadn't gone quietly. After her attempted corporate coup failed, she'd launched a vicious legal battle that ultimately exposed far more of her misdeeds than even Thomas had discovered. Faced with potential criminal charges for embezzlement, she'd accepted a settlement requiring her to return the diverted funds and relinquish all claims to Thomas's estate. Last I heard, she'd relocated to Arizona and was already engaged to another, wealthy older man. Michael placed a cup of coffee beside me. "Penny, for your thoughts?" "Just reflecting," I said, gesturing to the papers. "It feels like closing a chapter." These Saturday morning meetings had become our ritual, a time to discuss business and rebuild what had been broken between us. Michael had moved back temporarily after filing for divorce, and through difficult conversations and painful acknowledgments, we had slowly found our way back to each other. "The board approved the new direction," he said. Dad would have been proud. The company was evolving, shifting toward sustainable energy solutions, a change Thomas had contemplated but never implemented. Michael had found his own leadership style, guided more by ethics than expansion. "He would be proud of you," I agreed, "but not because of business decisions." "Have you thought more about Richard's offer?" Michael asked. Thomas's oldest friend had proposed creating a foundation for medical research into the disease that had taken my husband. The idea excited me, a chance to use my nursing background for something meaningful. "I'm meeting with him next week," I said, "and I've decided to sell the house." Michael nodded, understanding without judgment. "Where will you go?" "A cottage near the coast," I replied, feeling a spark of excitement. Small, but with an incredible garden and room for visitors. I gave him a meaningful look, including a certain grandson. Michael smiled. "Jacob asks about you constantly. Says Grandma Ellie makes the best cookies in the universe." Later, I stood in the garden Thomas had tended for years. The azaleas he'd planted were in full bloom, and new bulbs I'd planted in the fall were emerging, not replacing what was lost, but adding to the garden's story. I touched my wedding ring, now hanging on a chain around my neck. I wasn't ready to remove it entirely, but relocating it had been a conscious choice, honoring the past while making space for whatever came next. That memorial service had begun with rejection, with Vanessa declaring I had no place there. She had been wrong. My place wasn't defined by others' perceptions or manipulations. It was defined by love, the love I had shared with Thomas, the rekindled love between mother and son, and most importantly, the love I was finally learning to give myself. Thomas had given me one final gift, the truth that set us all free. And in that freedom, I had finally found exactly where I belonged.